Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Johnson and I'm a PhD student in the economics department. Today I'm going to talk to you about how new lending technology can affect house prices. Now, people like to talk about house prices a lot, and that's probably because house prices affect everyone's lives, regardless of whether you own a house or not. Now, some of you might remember that back in the early 2000s, house prices were growing rapidly. And as house prices grew, people started to make a lot of money. In turn, this led to more speculation and even more price growth. The thing is, these high prices actually weren't sustainable, and eventually prices stabilized and then started to fall. As prices declined, people started to lose money. And some people even lost their homes. But it wasn't just people who owned property who were affected by this. The decline in house prices had spillover effects on the financial system and the broader economy, creating a financial crisis followed by a deep and prolonged recession. Now, this painful experience raised the idea that perhaps these large fluctuations in house prices are very costly. And maybe this is something that we want to try to control more. But in order to do something about this problem, we need to understand what causes housing booms and busts. It would be nice to know what caused house prices to start rising back in the late 90s. And today, I'm going to tell you how computerization in the mortgage industry was an important part of that story. Back in 1991, computers weren't a core part of the mortgage application process, and lending rules had to be pretty simple so that bank employees could apply them easily. Now, a common lending rule that banks often used was the requirement that the loan repayment could not exceed 36% of your income. If the repayment would be higher than this, the application would simply be denied. By 1999, things had changed a lot. Not only was your information being recorded and stored electronically, computers were actually being used to decide how much you could borrow and whether your loan would be approved or not. Now, this really changed the lending process because it allowed banks to use more sophisticated lending rules, and this allowed them to lend more money to more people. What this chart shows is the simple lending rule I told you about before, where the repayment can't exceed 36% of your income. The idea behind this rule is that as the repayment chews up more of your income, the probability that you pay on time goes down. And that makes the bank more cautious about lending you money. The thing is, with the help of computers, it became a lot easier to analyze repayment data. And that meant that banks could look for groups of people who reliably pay on time. Now, one thing people realized is that borrowers who had a high credit score when they went to apply for the mortgage almost always pay on time, even when the repayment is large relative to their income. And what this suggests is perhaps we could use a slightly more complicated rule like this one, which basically says that you can have a repayment which is high relative to your income, but only if your credit score exceeds some cutoff. Now, we could also have an even slightly more complicated rule where there are a variety of different repayment cutoffs depending on your credit score. And these more sophisticated rules allowed banks to lend more money to more people profitably. And people started to take this money and use it to buy better houses. Now, the thing is, when everyone starts to do this at once, sometimes what happens is they just bid up the price of available houses. And this has feedback effects as people scramble to buy more housing before the price goes up even more. And if this process continues, we can end up with a big housing boom followed by a bust. Now, this is a nice story, but you're probably wondering whether we can actually test it. Fortunately for us, some lenders adopted this software earlier than others. And this adoption process really took off after 1995, when the software that most lenders ended up using first became available. So what I'm going to do to measure the effect of software on house prices is I'm going to look at locations where local lenders adopted the software at different times. I'm going to compare zip code A, which doesn't have the software, with zip code B, which does. And I'm going to track how prices diverge over time in these two locations. So let's start in 1993. What I'm going to show you is every year how prices are different in zip code A relative to zip code B. And what we're looking for is a big divergence in prices after 1995, which is when zip code B adopted the software. So in 1994, prices have moved pretty similarly in both zip codes, and this is also true in 1995. But in 1996, house prices have started to grow more strongly in the zip code with the software, and this process continues in 1997 and in 1998. So what I've shown you here is that locations where banks adopted the software early experienced a local housing boom before the national boom. Now, probably what you're wondering is, if this software came out in 1995, how come we didn't see a national boom until the late 90s or even the early 2000s in some places? And that's because the software was adopted gradually. And to get a sense for what that gradual software adoption looks like, I'm going to combine the price divergence I just described with information on how software adoption changed over time, which gives us this. So basically what you can see here is that software adoption explains the timing of the housing boom pretty well. But what's important to keep in mind is it doesn't fully explain the acceleration in prices that happened between around 2002 and 2006. So while the software can explain the timing of the boom, it doesn't fully explain why the boom was so big. Now, today I told you how new lending technology allowed banks to make better decisions and lend more money to more people profitably. Now, this sounds really great, but what's important to keep in mind is that when banks change their lending rules in this way, it can lead prices to rise. And once people see that prices are rising, this can lead to a housing boom, followed by a bust. And maybe that's something we want to do something about. Thank you.